One of my great loves in life is mythology, and I'm unpacking some books from my new library. I still have a lot to unpack, but I'm coming across a lot of my Norse mythology books. So I thought I'd take some time to share those with you. If you want to get started in Norse mythology, here's a good place to start. First, if you just want a quick summary, a friend recommended this book to me years ago. This is Edith Hamilton's Mythology. It has a good 20-page or so summary of a lot of the Norse mythology. It's a pretty good place to start, but I want to give you some source texts from history. These are good places if you want to read the documents for yourself. What's interesting to me is that these people who are Viking or Norse, they're connected, I think, some way to the Germanic peoples. And so many of these stories of that we'll talk about, they are connected. There are Germanic versions of them because if you go back far enough in history, I think these peoples sort of blend together, and they have a common collective unconsciousness, as Jung would say, about some of these stories. And there are also the Norse version, the Germanic version, and then there's a modern retelling, and of course my favorite opera, which is Richard Wagner's The Ring Cycle, and we'll talk about that briefly. I'm going to start with a great epic poem that I can't quite pronounce. It's Hald Cavita. The reason I want to start with this is because somewhere in the distant memory of the Vikings, they went to war with the Huns. And there's an epic poem about this, but this theme actually takes place in some of their later stories where they can't quite, I think, remember what the Huns looked like or their culture, and they imagine them as sort of an old Norse or Viking people. But that's a great place to start, and I don't think it'll take you an awful long time to read. A second epic poem that will take you maybe an hour to read is the Battle of Maldon. And this is actually a sort of tragic tale, but an epic battle between the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings. The Vikings were invading the British Isles, as you know, and King Alfred, which we'll come to, organized England to fight them off in what became Christianized England. But there was the Anglo-Saxon so-called invasion, and the Anglo-Saxons settled there. So you had the Celts and the Brits and the Anglo-Saxons. Well, the Anglo-Saxons also fought off the Viking invasions. Invasions seem to be a way of life for these Vikings, and some of this I admire as far as their courage is concerned, but as far as some of their actions, I think it's disdainful and dishonorable. Ironically, they took slaves. The chattel slavery was a common thing amongst the Vikings. But this poem is the Anglo-Saxons, who were also, I think, Germanic peoples, who were a warlike people. The Anglo-Saxons lived in the ruins of Rome, of the Roman ruins that dotted the landscape to this day of the British Isles. And I read a poem about this. It's actually sort of sad. They lived amongst the ruins of these great aqueducts and things that they knew that they didn't know how to build. So there was cultural decline in their time. But they were rough, tough people who actually became Christians. And there's beautiful, The Dream of the Rood is an epic poem from the Anglo-Saxons. There's beautiful crosses and crucifixes from these people. Well, they have an epic battle fighting off the Vikings, and sadly, they fought valiantly. And one of the kings fought, taking out many Vikings, but there just weren't enough of them. Perhaps their leadership wasn't prepared, and they lost. If they would have had horses, it might have been a different story, but that Battle of Maldon is telling about those Anglo-Saxons fighting to the death, trying to repel the heathen. From there, a good thing to read would be the Saga of the Volsungs. This is an older translation, but there is a newer translation by a resource I would highly recommend. That is the YouTube channel of Dr. Jackson Crawford. He's out of Colorado. He's an expert and a specialist in Norse mythology. He did his own translation. I have a hard copy. I have it on Audible. It's fantastic. Right now, you can get the Audible for about $8. It'll take you about 5 hours to listen to. In that story, it's the rise, no spoilers, but it's the rise in light spoiler, the fall of the Volsungs. These are people who were descended from Volsi. There's epic characters that reoccur throughout the Eddas, which we'll talk about, and even Wagner's Ring Cycle. Sigurd, Siggy, Rerir, the dragon named Fafnir, who's also in Wagner's Ring Cycle, spelled differently, spelled in the Germanic. But this begins with um, basically a man murdering a slave who he thought was outshining him in hunting. And this was considered dishonorable, but so also was murdering a slave. And so this man ran away to Hunland, and he became the king of Hunland. And essentially, they saw the Huns as essentially a Viking people. And it's the rise and fall, a lot of vengeance, a lot of blood feuds between uh, these various families. Odin makes several appearances. He gives a sword. The one man can pull the sword from the stone, one of the descendants of Volsi. And another king says, well, it should be mine. I will give you a fair price for the sword. Well, the descendant of Volsi is like, no, no, no. The old man, Odin, put this in the tree. And if you would have pulled it out, it would have been rightfully yours, but the sword chose me. So he dishonors this king by saying you can't have it. And that starts this crazy blood feud. There's magic in the story. There's magic apples. There's a story of survival with a tricking a wolf, all kinds of crazy things. It's not a perfectly coherent story, and I think the reason of that is it's someone in history tried to compile many probably stories about these people that were handed down around campfires or maybe on warships headed to war somewhere, and he did his best to sort of make them seamless, but they're not quite seamless. Still highly worth a read. One of my favorite books of all time is the Iliad, but another one of my favorite books is Beowulf. Tolkien himself did a beautiful translation of Beowulf, and perhaps you've seen Tolkien's beautiful prose. Well, just imagine that prose, but in an actually old Germanic, pagan, Norse type story. And there's been debate in academia about whether or not this was a pagan story or a Christian story, because as you know, these people were initially pagan and quite violent. But they eventually Christianized, which we'll come back to. This is a big part of their history. In fact, the Christians, if I understand this correctly, with Codex Reginus, I think it's called, preserved a lot of the knowledge that we have about Norse literature in one particular codex that was handed to a bishop. At the cusp, out of the pulling up, sort of a waking up from a dream of the old paganism into Christianity with the conversion of kings like King Bluetooth. And Bluetooth is what they named the actual technology after. They named it after the king, who was a unifier. And maybe we don't know the details about these lives because there are contradictory accounts, but what I do know is I read somewhere one of these kings, a missionary came to him. It might have been the Anglo-Saxons. A missionary came to him, some Catholic Christian missionary, and was presenting the gospel of Jesus Christ, which would have been rather strange to them. And he called together his wise men and said, hey, what do we do? And the wise men were like, well, our gods haven't really helped us like we wanted. I think we should convert. And they converted. It's just an interesting thing. So for all the people out there, concerning paganism, consulting paganism as, I don't think modern paganism is actual paganism. I think it's a pseudo-paganism, but I do understand their appreciation of nature, their disillusionment with materialism and consumerism and modernity and the inhumanity of moving away from growing our food and killing our food. I do very much understand that, but to those folks, I would give them the advice to follow in their forebears, and that is to convert to Christianity. So you have the Beowulf poem, and it's just beautiful. I need to reread it. If you get that copy from Tolkien, I think you can get it for less than $20 hardcover. In the back there are his notes, and in the end he gives his take on it. The good professor. I think it's both a pagan and Christian story. I think it's some things are baptized, if you will. There are good things. The old pagans did have some of the virtues, right? They had courage. The Vikings certainly had courage, even if it bled into brashness. Well, when someone converts from a culture, and especially an entire people group begins to convert, it's not as though they turn into modern American evangelicals overnight. They keep their culture. And so some of these stories were kept, but then they saw them, I think, with a light of the synthesis of knowledge that Christianity brings. And so Professor Tolkien gives his take on all that, and it's highly worth a read. That's one of those books that'll it's just worth sitting outside around a campfire and reading with a good pipe. Here are the two obvious choices. Is the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda by Snorri. Can't quite pronounce his name. Sorrelson, I think, is his name. But this is a later composed. Snorri took these stories, I think, and composed them later. But you have stories of Ragnarok and all the various characters in mythology, the one-eyed Odin and all this good stuff. There are two types of Norse poetry. There's the Eddas, which have to do with mythology or the gods, and there's the other word I can't pronounce that starts with an S that has to do with the kings who were living at the time. The Poetic Edda is one of my favorites. I need to reread it more thoroughly. The names do confuse me a bit. There's just a lot of names that change, and so that does trip me up. In your reading of this, you'll find that Tolkien took the names of some of the dwarves straight from the Eddas, and J.K. Rowling took the name of Fenrir Greyback, the werewolf from the Harry Potter series. It's just the name of Fenrir, the wolf character, the mythological wolf character. This is obviously a great collection of Norse mythology. This is the life of Alfred the Great. This is Asser's Life of King Alfred and other contemporary sources by Penguin Classics, and it actually does talk about Viking invasions. And King Alfred was really one of the first great kings of England who unified a people, established a military for protection, began to protect people, promoted virtue, literacy. There are some people who are skeptical of this because he seems to be such a good person. They're skeptical that any such virtuous man existed, but whatever he did a lot to build England as we know it today, Angloland. The Anglo-Saxons, or the Angels, as I think a pope called them, back when they were still pagans. This is a great book for many reasons, but it does discuss some of the Viking history. I'm going to give you some strange ones. This is J.R.R. Tolkien's The Legend of Sigurd and Gudrun. This is his personal retelling, and it's beautiful, of some of the great characters of Norse mythology. He loved the stories so much. In fact, you'll see them echoed in The Lord of the Rings, and we'll talk about that in a minute. He loved it so much he did his own version of that great story, and it's just beautiful. That reminds me, Tolkien did his own translation of the Battle of Maldon with the homecoming of one of the major characters there, which he wrote, as I understand it, as a sequel to the Great Battle. It captured his imagination, just as C.S. Lewis and Tolkien's, their minds are both captured by mythology, particularly Norse mythology. Tolkien wrote his own sequel to that, and it's beautiful. I wanted to mention this. This is my favorite opera. This is actually the novelized version of it. This is a beautiful book of this. Is from I think it's Barnes and Noble Classics. This is our Penguin Classics, actually, yeah. Richard Wagner's The Ring of the Nibelung. And it's a sort of a novelized translation. It reads rather like a poetry, but it's the Germanized version of these stories. But there's a twist. So Odin is Wotan, things like this. But it is not an ancient story. This is a very modern man, Wagner, in a time of modern Germany. Post-Faust, post-Martin Luther. It really can't be overstated the influence that the Reformation and Martin Luther had on Germany, modern Germany. And we could talk about that at length, but this is a modern man who does not believe in the gods. He sees them rather as psychologically, or the emergence of consciousness from the ancient world, the world of dream and symbol, of legend. But he does tell a very coherent, perhaps the most coherent, ironically, seeming together of all the great Norse myths. And if you don't, I haven't actually sat down and read this thing together, but I've read quite a bit of it. But what I love is the opera, Richard Wagner's opera, though I disagree with the man vehemently. And on that point, a man I deeply respected was Roger Scruton. This is The Ring of Truth, the wisdom of Wagner's Ring of the Nibelung. And Roger Scruton, over the course of his life, rejected postmodernism. He rejected Marxism. He rejected what's called liberalism or leftism, though it's not always liberal. And He wanted to get modern humans back in contact with what he saw as the transcendent, and so he promoted the great art of the Western world. He promoted the great music because he realized that humanity needs something above them. He realized humanity needs something that we aspire to and that, in some sense, can judge us. We don't do well. We've desacramentalized the world. We've de-enchanted the world, and this has been to our detriment. And Roger Scruton knew this. So by the end of his life, as I've discussed on the channel, he became an Anglican, though I don't think he fully believed in God. He was also, he actually thought that Tolkien was the vulgar artist and or the vulgar popularizer, and that Wagner was the true artist. So it's a good book if you want to understand sort of a modern take, a modern German take looking back at their more Germanic histories. Now, I haven't found the book yet, but I do have an English translation of the actual German version of some of these myths, and it is, same names, just kind of Germanified, if you will. And I want to plug this book. If you do want to know more about Tolkien, this book is one of my favorite books written in the last several years. This is Tolkens Faith, a spiritual biography by Holly Ordway. It's a beautiful book. I mean, it's just absolutely, it's printed gorgeously. But if you want to know more about the man Tolkien himself and how he saw culture, modernity, the Lord of the Rings, this book and one called Tolkien's Modern Reading together really give you a fuller picture of who this gentleman was. Some people have asked me, as a Christian, how do I make sense of this? Well, I love Norse mythology, but of course, I don't think that actual witchcraft would be a good thing. I don't think actually some of the sacrifices of these pagans, some of the actions they did would be a good thing. I do think that as secularism has washed over the Western world, I think there's a bit of naivete about it. The new atheists thought that if we would just get rid of Christianity, well, we could just live in this perfectly enlightened state of reason and science. We've already seen that this is not how humanity works. Paganism, pseudo-paganism is on the rise amongst people descended from Europeans. Some people are trying to get back in touch with, a lot of young black women are trying to get back in touch with tribal religion. I don't see either of these as being particularly healthy. I think Islam is going to gain more influence, and I think pagan views would take more root. I don't think you're going to live in this default state of boring, reduced materialism. Some type of spirituality is going to come back in, and people are they're realizing the modern world is flawed, and they're looking back before the modern world. They're trying to find their roots. And as a Christian, I think this is a good opportunity to understand these things. And I see truth as somewhat of a synthesis, is a word a Catholic theologian used. This is a book by an Eastern Orthodox gentleman, When Athens Met Jerusalem by John Mark Reynolds. And this is talking specifically about Hellenistic philosophy and culture. There was an ancient Christian, I believe it was Tertullian, who said, "What hath Athens to do with Jerusalem?" In other words, Greek thought, philosophy, religion, mythology has nothing to do with what Christianity has to say. I think he was wrong. I think another extreme that's wrong is this ridiculous notion that Christianity simply copied and pasted, borrowed from pagan myths. I actually looked into that. That's absolute nonsense. In fact, some of the gods that pre-existed the life of Jesus of Nazareth adjusted their stories after Christianity began to be popular and people missed that nuance. If anything, some of these religions borrowed from Christianity to try to make it more palatable to changing audiences. I think that if God does exist, and I think that God does exist, that he knows the hearts of all humans, the minds of all humans, and I don't think he has limited his actions to a particular geographic location. So I do not think that paganism is a good thing in the sense of, sacrificing humans, getting rid of the theological virtues, tribalism, things like this, some of the sexual ethics of some of the pagans. Even still, there were virtuous pagans. Even Dante says this. Justin Martyr wrote to a very famous Roman, and he was trying to explain that Christianity, in his view, there was so much truth in some of the old pagan thinking that he believed, and I think he might have been onto something, that God was actually preparing the hearts and minds of people around the world in their stories and their religions and their philosophy to accept Christ. And I was staggered by reading Aristotle and Plato and seeing just sort of how far they got. You know, Aristotle and Plato would have been amazed to think that the God that they reasoned must exist, which is what the scripture says humans can do, could be known personally, that he could be experienced in the Mass, that he could be prayed to. I think this would have amazed them. But I was amazed to see exactly how far they reasoned, that there was a God above their local pantheons. I think there have been some chiefs on this continent of the nations that were here prior to the Europeans that had reasoned this out as well. I don't think all native religions were particularly good. The human sacrifices in the southern continent were it's demonic, if anything. If there is no demonic, which at this point, unfortunately, I think there is, it's still evil, objectively. That said, there is a value in truth in, I think, in these various religions. I could say the same about Taoism. I see Christianity as the fulfillment of, the synthesis of truth, which is why I think some of the pagan kings eventually began to it wasn't all political, began to Christianize, because there were shadows and echoes of things that made sense of them and clicked in the fuller story of Christianity. One of the things that has amazed me most, and I don't have words for it, is the idea that all these stories, you know, Joseph Campbell wrote about the hero's journey. He tried to cram all the world's stories a bit too much, I think. But there was something there. And by the way, this is an actual Roman coin I'm holding. This is from the era of Constantine the Great. I think it was made by his sons, if you can see it. It's an actual Roman coin, which I think is pretty cool. I keep it in my office. It's not worth much, but it's cool. I read these things in history, but it's cool to see them and touch them with my own hands, or to visit these places. It gives the stories more flavor, because of the more color. But I think there's so much truth in these old stories that it sort of made sense at some point. All these stories from around the world, I think the things that are longing for, the shadows and echoes. I mean, even in the Norse mythology, you have a promised great hero, a great warrior who's going to try to save the gods, if you will, save the world by defeating a serpent, by defeating the dragon. We could go on and on about that, but what surprised me was that all this met in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. And it turns out that this was actually a historical person. So even if the legends were embellished, which I think we have good reason to know a lot about who this man actually was, from Jewish religion to even the echoes and longing shadows, I think, in some of the old pagan religions, all this met in this historical figure. I don't have words for that, but that is one of the most profound things that I don't think I'll ever get over that. One more cool thing, you can look on the internet, and there's a lot about the dawn of the early modern world, or even the medieval world, from the age of legend. I don't always know what to do with some of the things that these folks claimed. I don't mean the early ancient world, I mean what was ancient to the ancients. But even in some of these historians, they'll say, hey, yeah, don't go over there on that mound, there's a dragon there. You know, what do you do with that? Or was it purely symbolic? Was it purely psychological? Did it embody danger, or what did he see? Yeah, I don't know. But what's interesting is many of these figures who may perhaps were embellished had some basis in actual history. For example, King Hrothgar from Beowulf, they found burial mounds, and it's possible that they found the remains of a great king buried with bearskins and a great sword and all this. It's possible that some of these figures, and some of these poems even, whose names we have, were actual historical figures. I could go on and on, but I won't. So I want to leave you with that. So if you are interested in Norse mythology, I hope this gives you some things to think about, some places to start and read. I'm not an expert on this. I haven't mastered it. Again, I get the names mixed up sometimes, but the stories themselves are so good. Um, Even the movie Thor makes more sense after you read this stuff. I hope you enjoy it. As always, I appreciate you guys watching, and I hope you know that your life matters, and that if you're going through a hard time, just don't forget that there are people that love you, and that those dark days will pass, so keep living your life, all right? This stuff reminds me to get outside and seek adventure, because the modern world with Netflix and McDonald's, I like all that, but it's good to get outside. The world is so interesting that you could just spend your entire life learning about history or science or art or literature or exploring, I think, and live a very full life. So I hope this video encourages you to do that just a little bit more. As always, I thank you for watching. God bless.